Welcome back, family, to Black House Live's book lecture series, where we are still discussing Dr. Amos Wilson's Blueprint for Black Power. Our last lecture was on chapter 26, where Wilson discussed the importance of Black owned banks and the role that they will play in the economic revitalization of the African American community globally. In chapter 27, in this chapter, I'm actually going to cover two chapters in this particular lecture. We're going to discuss chapter 27, Financing Black Economic Development, as well as chapter 29, the Investment Club. They really connect relatively seamlessly, and they were two relatively short chapters, and so I wanted to put them both together. It didn't make sense to lecture on them separately. So in chapter 27, Financing Black Economic Development, Dr. Wilson in this chapter, in chapter 27 through chapter 30, um, describes a number of ways that the African American and Pan-African economic system can be financed by initiatives set forth and controlled by that African American and Pan-African community, right? Wilson argues that their main purpose, those initiatives, is to stimulate and focus conversations in the African community regarding the means of financing its own economic development and enhancing its economic well-being. All right, so I'm excited to jump right into it. According to Wilson, chapters 27 through chapter 30 suggest and describe ways that an African American and Pan African economic system could be financed by initiatives set forth and controlled by the African American and Pan African community, right? And so we'll be discussing those initiatives in this particular chapter. Development banks. Uh, According to Wilson, the placing of large deposits in developmental banks or loan funds by individuals and institutions would be similar in effect to the expansion of the money supply by the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States. And so, very similarly, in the same way that when the United States government needs money, it needs funds, the Federal Reserve Bank is able to provide those funds through loans, right, to the United States government. Development banks are banks that are created to assist governments and countries that are underfunded and in need of financial support. Wilson suggests that in the same ways that development banks are used to support countries and governments in need, they can be structured to support communities in need, right? So Wilson explains that if development banks could make more sizable loans to local community banks, right, and community development credit unions and other financial institutions, which in turn will make those loans to consumers and to businesses. We'll talk more in this lecture about development banks as well as community development credit unions. Wilson argues that if the new deposits in Black-owned banks were cycled through a chain of Black-owned banks in the form of loans, then the money supply would be greatly expanded, since every time any bank in the chain opened an account for a new borrower, the total number of people and businesses authorized to write would have expanded, right? So we know that through the expansion, the increase of support into Black banks, right, then the more services those Black banks can provide to the community and to individuals. Wilson explains that checks are forms of money. And according to Wilson, as the Black community increases the volume of its banks and financial institutional reserves, it stimulates credit expansion. So, therefore, an increased amount of loanable funds becomes available for businesses and consumers, right? So, where we increase our support to Black banks, right, Black banks can increase the amount of loanable funds, right, to the community. So, according to Wilson, these are the long-term effects of the Black community increasing our support for our own Black financial institutions, right? The more we support them, the more resources and services they're able to provide to the community. According to Wilson, one of the ways banks may more directly engage in the economic development of their communities without violating the traditional roles and rules and laws of banking is to found and to organize and support a network of banks that are designed specifically for the purpose of community development, right? So one of the ways Wilson is saying that banks can more directly engage in the economic development of their communities is by supporting community development banks. What are community development banks? Well, according to Wilson, community development banks are financial institutions which provide capital for the business and infrastructural development for their communities. Community development banks are one among a number of institutions designed to aid depressed areas, including community credit unions, right, and revolving loan funds. So for Black and Brown communities that are struggling with economic development, community development banks, right, are the resources that are supposed to support those communities. According to Wilson in 1993, the Clinton administration proposed an $850 million fund to help finance community development institutions. According to the Wall Street Journal, the money would be used to finance banks, credit unions, and revolving loan funds. One of the development banks that the Clinton administration cited as an example was the South Shore Bank in Chicago, which still exists today. According to Wilson, unlike conventional banks, South Shore Bank specialized in providing loans to fledgling minority entrepreneurs to buy and renovate small apartment buildings in poor Chicago. Citing the Wall Street Journal, Wilson explains that the South Shore Bank is owned by foundations, churches, and big corporations, the ultimate impatient capital, but it borrows and lends at a profit just like any other bank. So Wilson is providing us with this example of the South Shore Bank that was intentionally created to support the Black businesses in that community. Wilson explains that private nonprofit loan funds can, unlike their counterparts, afford to provide loans to their borrowers at forward points above prime rates. The members, right, of this South Shore Bank, it is owned by foundations and churches, right? So the community literally has stake and equity, right, in the ownership of this particular bank. And thus, by it being a nonprofit loan fund, right, it is able to provide loans to their borrowers that doesn't have as many strings attached. Wilson argues that individual churches, church associations, professional organizations, and other organized groups, either together or separately, can fund development banks or loan funds designed to make or facilitate loans of various sizes. So churches, different Black clubs and organizations in community can help to start community development banks, right, that are geared and structured toward providing specific loans to those folks in the community. Credit unions. In addition to the community development banks, there are community development credit unions. And so according to Wilson, the credit union movement is a great example of cooperative economics and is growing rapidly. According to Wilson, a number of inner city neighborhoods, presumably abandoned or underserved by banks or traumatized by the social disruptions such as urban riots, are establishing credit unions to service their populations. Wilson explains that the credit union offers savings accounts, loans, and other financial services to neighborhood individuals, churches, and businesses. Types of credit unions. According to Wilson, there are two types of credit unions. Federally or state chartered credit unions, like those operated by churches, unions, and membership organizations of various types for the sole benefit of their depositors, more commonly referred to as shareholders. So your federally or state chartered credit unions are those that are operated by particular church congregations, unions, right, or members of a particular type of organization, right, and they're referred to as shareholders. The second type of credit union is what is called the Community Development Credit Union. And this chapter specifically focuses on this type of credit union. Citing the National Credit Administration, the NCUA, in 1988, Wilson explains that a federal credit union is a member-owned corporation organized to promote thrift among its members and to promote loans to its members from these accumulated savings. Wilson explains that the principal purpose of a federal credit union is to encourage and support its members to accumulate savings out of their income as a means of building economic security for themselves and for their families. So what Wilson is saying, right, is that these credit unions, the reason why alternatively they are better than a traditional bank, right, is that it helps individuals build income, right? As a way of developing economic security, right? Not only for themselves, but for their families. According to Wilson, membership in the federal credit union is limited to those groups or persons with a common bond of employment, association, or residence. And so Wilson keeps using the example of, Black congregations and Black churches, right? Many Black folks who live in the same neighborhood, same communities, go to similar churches, right? They may work in similar areas of employment, right? Which would allow those members to join a credit union or create their own credit union. So Wilson argues that the most pertinent aspect about credit unions relative to the African American community has to do with control and management, right? Wilson recognizes that, when it comes to these financial institutions, one of the great things that we lack, right, is ownership, right? There's mismanagement, right, of funds and things of that nature. And so, as described by the NCUA, control of management is in the hands of the members of the credit union, right? Each member has one vote, regardless of the number of shares owned. Every depositor is a shareholder in the union, and the organization is completely owned by and operated by its members. And so, in other words, a credit union is a democratic bank where members pool their savings and make loans to each other, right? So, as Wilson stated, this is a truly cooperative economics at display here, right? And a financial institution created by Black folks for Black folks. According to Wilson, a major advantage of starting a credit union, in contrast to starting a bank, is that a credit union may be opened with little or no initial equity. That is, organizers who wish to found a credit union are not required to meet minimum capital requirements, right? And so, in order to start a bank, right, you have to have a certain amount of money, right? You're trying to garner a community of people, right, to go into this venture with you. But Wilson is saying that credit unions don't require that kind of startup cash, right? That's the type of equity. And so it might be within the interest of a community of Black folks to start a credit union as opposed to a traditional bank. Community development credit unions. According to Wilson, community development credit unions, or CDCUs, offer credit and financial services that are very often scarcely available to or affordable for a very large number of low-income individuals and families, right? So if you come from a certain economic status and background, right? If you tend to be more along the lines, right, of the lumpen proletariat, to use a socialist terminology, right? Um, then the community development credit unions, right, are a better option because they provide services to those groups of people that they would not be able to get at traditional banks. All right. Seidenthalen and Pobb, in 1991, CDCUs differ from traditional banks and other credit unions in at least two ways. One is that the primary members of a community development credit union are precisely those who are not likely to be served by standard banks and credit unions, right? And the financial services needed by their members may be different from those offered by other financial institutions. And so CDCUs are created specifically to meet the needs of disenfranchised folks, right? And they offer services that typically disenfranchised people wouldn't be able to get in other places, right? One of the second ways in which they are different from traditional banks is that the community development credit union is primarily designed to promote local community development through lending activities, right? So that credit union in that regional area, right, is supporting the businesses, the economic objectives and ideas of folks within that particular community, within that particular zip code, right? A mission they'll share with the other development financial institutions, such as loan funds and development banks. However, unlike other development lenders, community development credit unions specialize in small loans made directly to people, home buyers and improvers, students, workers, and small businesses, right? And so these CDCUs will be great in that those loans will get into the hands of the people who need them most. Citing Tholen and Podge, Wilson explains that community development credit unions are committed to the development of community control and leadership, which means control over the credit union itself and through the credit union over the economic resources of the community, right? So the CDCU is like, it is a great example, right, of uh, the community working together to meet the needs of its own members. Wilson argues that credit unions enhance the development of a sense of social interest, social responsibility, and reliability as they encourage savings through regular deposits or payroll deductions. So there is a sense of uh, uh, responsibility and accountability, right, for members who are part of a particular credit union, right? A percentage of your monies is going into this credit union every week, every 2 weeks, right? Uh, and because you are a part of this, and because you are being held accountable um, by the other members of this organization and this institution, it helps to develop that sense of social interest that we all are working towards something. That if this succeeds, we all do well, right? But if it doesn't succeed, right, we will all be impacted by that as well. And so they have a sense of social interest where we all are committed, right, to the success of this credit union. We have a sense of social responsibility, right? Because again, all of us can be negatively impacted or positively impacted by what happens here at this financial institution. So Wilson argues that by providing account services to people who may not have had them before, by providing financial management responsibilities to their staffs, volunteers, right, interested members and trainees, by providing their clients with attractive credit facilities and valuable know-how, credit unions help people bring uh, into and familiarize them with the financial mainstream. Credit unions help to familiarize Black folks and non-traditional people, right, with mainstream finances, right, with mainstream banking, thereby enhancing their ability to qualify for loans and other financial services. Credit unions, according to Wilson, could be the means by which Black folks acquire financial literacy and a financial vocabulary that allows them to go into this industry, right, and become dominant, become successful. According to Wilson, traditional banks may also provide support to CDCUs. According to Wilson, CDCUs help to fill the void left by banks that have abandoned certain communities, right? Certain banks that were not successful, they have to close their doors, they have to shelter the services that they were providing, right? Well, those community development credit unions can help to step in and fill those voids once those banks have to close their doors. According to Wilson, CDCUs provide services for very low income people who are members of communities that cannot provide profitable markets and accounts for banks. There are certain individuals in the community, based on their credit score, based on their financial history, don't qualify for bank accounts, can't open bank accounts currently. CDCUs can provide supports and services for those particular individuals. According to Wilson, financial support of CDCUs by banks is now recognized federal regulators as one of the important means by which they can satisfy Community Reinvestment Act requirements. So remember, the federal government requires banks and other financial institutions to contribute a certain percentage of their monies, right, to underserved communities. And so Wilson is making the argument that CDCUs, by contributing to CDCUs, many of those mainstream banks could fulfill that federal obligation. Wilson explains that banks can also donate property, equipment, or services. Property may include buildings, abandoned branches, computers, and other types of office equipment, right? According to Wilson, services may include marketing and public relations assistance and training for credit union tellers or loan officers. And so everything does not have to solely be money or solely be financial. We recognize that the knowledge and the know-how, right, would also be a tangible gain for Black financial institutions. In our last lecture in chapter 26, we discussed that one of the major downfalls of Black banks historically, right, was its lack of knowledge, its poor mismanagement, its poor management of its banks. And in order to ensure that this does not happen in the future, we have to be providing constant and consistent professional development for our bank leaders. According to Wilson, churches can play a crucial role in assisting development credit unions by utilizing their institutional resources. influence with banks and other financial institutions, political influence, organizing community efforts, and by encouraging their members to support CDCUs. Churches can make deposits in CDCUs. Citing the suggestion from Thalin and Podge, credit unions can also be an investment option for individual congregations, providing an alternative to certificate or deposit money market funds. And so what Wilson is saying here, right, is that CDCUs can help be a financial alternative to the Black community, a financial alternative to banks for the Black community, right? Um, in that if particular groups, right, particular Black organizations, groups, and institutions were to invest, right, their monies into these credit unions, right, then those credit unions could provide the loan services to these businesses, communities, and individuals that are so needed. So if we were to return to the economic plan that Du Bois was presenting to us earlier, right? Black churches can use their segregation, right? Their isolation to their advantage. Black congregations can create or utilize the local credit unions in their areas and invest in those as individual congregations, providing an alternative to traditional banking. According to Wilson, a community development corporation is an officially incorporated group whose primary aim is to help the members of a particular community advance their economic development and ownership and control of the resources in their communities. So we just got on top about CDCUs. Wilson also then introduces community development corporations. And he says that the goal and the aim of a community development corporation is to help advance the economic development and ownership and control of resources in particular communities. So Wilson explains that while the CDC may be founded by federal agencies, the CDC more truly is a community corporation that is financed through stocks and bonds sold in the local community. So if these loan funds flow through the Black community, the African community, right, as loans to these communities, as loans to the Black banks, as loans to the Black credit unions, as loans to Black savings and loans associations, right? Those Black financial institutions are able to expand the amount of services they can provide the community. However, Wilson does caution us that to the extent that CDCs are not self-sustaining, right, supported or financed substantially by the community, by both the local and ethnic community as a national and regional whole, to the extent that it is dependent on financing from large corporations, foundations, and government agencies, it may be mortally crippled or destroyed by their withdrawal or support. Wilson is telling us very clearly that if our community development credit unions or community development corporations are heavily dependent on governmental resources, governmental funding, right, then they're doomed to fail from the beginning. The government has no vested interest in seeing, right, Black banks and the Black community become an economic competitor to them and for them, right? And so again, we recognize that if we are going to advance the economic objectives of African people this world over, right, that is going to happen through us financing our own economic realities. Venture capital. According to Wilson, the African American community is essentially a third world economy, meaning that it is greatly underdeveloped, undercapitalized, and investments in this enterprise are considered to be high risk, which is defined as being managerially inept, inefficient, poorly organized, understocked, and ill-equipped, right? High risk, like investment into Africa, said that like, investment into, Black communities, right, or into African businesses, right, are high risk, and that you may not see any financial return on that investment, right, at least initially. Wilson explains why that's the case. Right? It's not anything inherent in African businesses. It's not anything inherent, right, in newly developing nascent Black businesses, right? But it has more to do with the racist, white supremacist economic structures that are put into place, right? And so, as a result, according to Wilson, there is little or no infrastructural means for the enterprises that exist to mutually support each other, mutually expand and strengthen their specific markets and their economy as a whole, and to protect their markets against the incursions of outsiders, right? So, um, the way that African and Black economies are currently structured, right, as is, right, they're not in a advantageous position, right, to make any major changes, right, to impact the the mainstream economy in any significant type of way, right? But according to Wilson, there are few African American business associations and business leagues organized to strategically and tactically expand into and successfully penetrate the marketplaces of other communities or to pioneer and develop new markets. Wilson is saying that while currently, right, we don't have many businesses or a Pan-African economic market to rival the current mainstream European economic market, right? He says that there are African American businesses associations and business leagues, right? That gives us reason to pause, gives us reasons to be excited for the future, right? That if we increase, that if we were to expand the work that they're doing, right, they could potentially help to penetrate the mainstream economic system, all right? Or in the grand scheme of things, help us to develop our own unique um, market system, right, that serves not just the needs of us, right, but the mainstream society as well. And so, according to Wilson, the African American community can be perceived from an economic perspective as a newly developing nation. And so, Wilson explains the economic dilemma that a young nation like ours finds itself in. According to Wilson, Black enterprises are considered high risk investment because they are undercapitalized, and he argues that they are undercapitalized because they're considered high risk, right? So you see that kind of like catch 22. Wilson reminds us that this dilemma is not unique to the African American community, and that all underdeveloped or newly industrializing economies or new developing markets have dealt with similar situations. So Wilson explains that many nations had to mature and advance past the stage where their enterprises were considered risky or high risk investing, right? So this is a very normal, right, and natural process, right? But we can't get hung up here. We can't get stuck here in this space or at this stage, right, of development. We have to constantly be improving and getting better in this area. Wilson reminds us that it was the venture capital investments by European financiers, cartel stock companies, merchant banks, firms, and the like in fledgling American enterprises, which helped to substantially finance and organize the economic growth and development of U.S. economy in general. Right? You remember some of our previous lectures, we talked about the fact that when America was just starting out, when it was just one of the 13 colonies, right, it was funded by European nations. European corporations and organizations. They help to invest into a young, right, and nascent America that help it to become the great nation that it is today, right? Um, Wilson is reminding African people that in order for the African nation to move from this third world status that they're in, right, we have to invest into the African, wherever she or he is, right, in the continent. We have to invest in them, in their businesses, in the same way that Europeans invested into America and its 13 colonies in its earlier days. Why is this important? Wilson argues that if fledgling Black enterprises are going to be sustained, they're going to have to be financed by Black venture capitalists. According to Wilson, financial commitment by Black venture capitalists, very wealthy individuals or families, venture capital funds, and organizations is key to building African American and Pan African business organizations to the point where they can gain competitive advantage in several businesses or industrial fields. Wilson warns against the use and dependency of government-funded loans and government-type venture capital because he argues that the experience of Black enterprises with these sources of venture capital has been such that there's little reason to recommend their exclusive use by the Black community. Wilson is saying we have ample enough of examples, right? Where Black folks have been hurt by these government funded loans, right? By these government funded venture capitalists. What we need is funds with no strings attached. We need funds that come specifically from people who look like us, who are invested in the economic revitalization of our community. All right. According to Wilson, despite their smaller capital bases, we believe that community-based and funded venture capital enterprises, organizations with no strings tied to government and non-Black financiers, are ultimately the most effective organizations for financing and supporting Black enterprise. We need that money with no strings attached, y'all. It doesn't mean that we don't have any accountability. It doesn't mean that we don't have to be great stewards, right, with our money, right? But it means that we cannot take loans, right, that are just as disadvantageous and problematic as the current economic situation we find ourselves in, right? The cure can't be worse than the diagnosis. According to Wilson, Black-owned venture capital funds should be able to exhibit a deeper and more functional understanding of the problems and needs of Black enterprises. They should also exhibit a greater tolerance, creativity, and flexibility when it comes to providing the most productive and least risky approaches to supporting the growth and development of Black enterprises, right? Wilson is saying that Black-owned venture capital funds, right, and folks who are lending, Black lenders who are lending money to Black businesses and Black organizations, they have to be a little bit more sensitive than our mainstream lenders. They got to be a little bit more flexible. They got to have a little bit more tolerance. Because ideally, these are the folks who get it. These are the folks who understand that at one point in time, they came from similar communities, right? And thus they know all the barriers, they know all of the hangups. And so Wilson says that they should also exhibit a greater tolerance, creativity, and flexibility when it comes to providing the most productive and least risky approaches to supporting the growth and development of Black enterprise. Black-owned venture capital funds and the expansion of the African American economy. According to Wilson, in order for the African American economy to draw parity with first world economies, with mainstream economies, it requires the high risk investment and of the high risk investment of venture capitalists. We're going to need Black venture capitalists, Black loan sharks, right, to invest money into Black enterprises with the understanding that they may not see profit for the first few years, that they may not see returns on that investment for the first few years. Wilson explains that this means that large sums of money must be made available to create and expand Black-owned businesses. Wilson explains that venture capital represents one of the major means by which funds are used by existing and new Black-owned companies to underwrite the development, the production, or marketing of new products, services, and technologies by Black-owned companies. Such a new or expanding company may develop, innovate, produce, or market regular or new products and services using new or innovative technologies or through creating economies of scale. Black folks, we got to put our money into Black banks so that these Black banks and Black financial institutions can support Black communities, right? You see situations right now that when Black men, Black women say certain things, right, that offend other groups, their monies can be threatened, right, to be done away with in those banks. But if our money was in our own community banks and our own community financial institutions in the first place, we don't have to worry about what some other people are going to do with our money. According to Wilson, Black-owned companies or newly developed Black-owned corporate entities can help to substantially and rapidly expand a Black American economy through becoming involved in joint ventures, mergers, or consolidations, acquisitions, and takeovers. Wilson defines a joint venture as a business partnership between independent companies, usually operating under the authority of a specifically designated and compensated manager for the purpose of achieving a particular business objective or completing a business deal. So Wilson explains that a merger involves the complete absorption of one business by another, where the acquiring business retains its name and identity after having acquired all the assets and liabilities of the acquired business. Wilson is saying that white folks don't have a monopoly, right, on joint ventures, on mergers, on business consolidation, right? So right now, during COVID, a ton of American businesses had to close their doors and shut down, right? Making room for Black businessmen and women to acquire those businesses, to merge their companies into those, right? To consolidate businesses. And so Wilson is saying that where it makes sense in the mainstream economy to acquire these businesses, merge these businesses, consolidate these businesses, we as African business men and women should do it. We should take advantage of it. Wilson argues that by engaging in mergers, consolidations, acquisitions, joint ventures, alliances, takeovers, and the like, the Black business establishments can, one, acquire ongoing, already established successful firms. We don't have to invent the wheel. We don't have to build new brick and mortar. They already exist. We're just taking over those bricks and mortars. Wilson says that we gain access to the know-how, the technology, the organization, talent, assets, contacts, and the like by merging and consolidating those businesses. We acquire those Rolodexes. We acquire those contact lists. We acquire the training materials, the curriculum, and thus are in positions to now train up our people. Wilson says that one of the other things that these ventures and alliances allow for, right, is that allows us to create virtual corporations by vertically and or horizontally integrating itself into an alliance with other companies whose productive output is complementary to our own in order to produce a finished product or service, which neither company could have produced alone, right? So it allows us to come into contact with businesses, right, that we can now serve and solve some aspect of a problem for them that they could not solve prior to us, right? And vice versa. We're able to join and partner with a company or with a business that now solves a problem or provides a service that we could not provide before the merger. Wilson argues that we gain access to new markets and the means of distributing and marketing products which were not previously available. So by stepping into the mainstream and acquiring the mainstream business, we now are able to stand in front of consumers, right, that we previously did not have access to. Wilson says that it creates employment and training opportunities for Blacks at the various levels of business and trade, which were previously restricted, right? When those businesses close their doors, right, and we acquire those businesses, we now can put our own people into those positions. We can now train our people up, right, to step into positions that they previously couldn't step into. It gained access to a knowledge of leading technologies and organizational techniques, as well as access to a talented, creative, and productive staff. Wilson argues that it allows us to enter into new industries previously closed to Blacks, speed the transfer of technology from the acquired or allied companies to other Black-owned companies to Africa and across the African diaspora. So as we now start to acquire this new information, right, this new training, these new techniques, we're able to disseminate it throughout the diaspora, throughout the continent. Wilson argues that it increases the wealth, power, and influence of Africans in the national and international economies of the world, right? By now acquiring these mainstream businesses, right, we are now able to make dictates, right, in the mainstream economic market, domestically as well as internationally. So according to Wilson, venture capitalist firms are instrumental in helping companies get started, helping companies expand and develop the kinds of relations and achieve some of the goals we just enumerated. According to Wilson, the African American community must increase its supply of venture capital firms, as well as greatly enhancing their capital resources and prowess. But to ensure that this expansion and empowerment, right, to ensure, Wilson argues that the funding of Black-owned venture capital companies must increasingly draw their underwriting funds from Black-owned and controlled corporations, endowments, pension funds, and Black individual investors. It is imperative, right, that the majority of the funds that are used to finance our economic revitalization comes specifically from independent Black folks. Black folk that are not controlled and puppeteered by governments, right, and other entities. Because if the majority of our finances, again, are dependent on the government or on outside forces, those individuals can make dictates on our community, on our businesses, on our organizations, and we don't want anybody outside of our community telling us what we have to do within our community. At this point, we are going to jump into chapter 29, the investment club, right? Again, in chapter 27, what we just got done looking at, right, and discussing were the specific financial institutions, right, that could be used to help to finance our economic revitalization, right? And specifically, Wilson talked about, black banks, but community development banks, right? That are created specifically to meet the needs of the communities that they're in. He also talked about community development credit unions, right? Where members of a particular congregation, members of a particular institution or organization can pool their resources, right? And put it into that credit union, and all of the members of that credit union are able to decide and dictate what happens with those monies, right? These are going to be the ways by which we finance our economic revitalization. At the end of that chapter, Wilson talked about venture capital and the important role that venture capital would play, and that Black venture capitalists specifically have a major role to play in investing in the communities, right? And investing in the Black economic revitalization. Okay. In chapter 29, Wilson discussed the ways in which investment, right, is going to help to finance the economic revitalization of the African community domestically as well as globally. So let's jump right into it. According to Wilson, the limited political influence and poverty of the African American community is closely related to its limited ownership of wealth, right? Its limited amount of finances and business assets, right, as well as our human capital. And so Wilson is saying that there is a direct correlation between Black poverty, African poverty, right, and Black and African political influence. Where there is no wealth in the African community, it is going to be extremely hard, right, to have political influence or economic influence or social cultural influence, right, without that wealth. And so, according to Wilson, blacks are less likely compared to whites to invest in equities, those being stocks, bonds, or mutual funds. The black middle class is hardly more likely to purchase financial instruments such as stocks than our working class white ethnics striving to upgrade their social status. According to Wilson, the discrepancy in investments between blacks and whites may in large part be due to the fact that black middle class is relatively young and has enjoyed affluence for only a relatively short time. And for psychohistorical reasons, right, has developed different spending patterns. So more basic reasons for the discrepancy may be a lack of strong interest in long-range investment and a lack of familiarity with investment instruments and procedures. And so what Wilson is saying here is that the reason why we may see the discrepancies between a white investment and black investment is that white folks have been investing in these markets longer than black folks have. They're more familiar with the process, right, than black folks, right? But Wilson also argues that a more basic explanation for this discrepancy just maybe the lack of strong interest, right? Black folks have not, for whatever reason, had an interest in investing in stocks, bonds, IRAs, right, mutual funds, and those kinds of things. All right. Wilson explains that there is also a relatively poor grasp by the black middle class and upper classes of the relationship between true political influence, power, and wealth. Right? Wilson is saying that if black folks truly understood that in order for black politicians to truly have the power and the influence that they need to change our communities in the way that we would like to see our communities change, then black folks and black communities have to have a different perspective about wealth and wealth accumulation. All right. Wilson argues that there's a relatively poor grasp by the black, middle, and upper classes of the relationship between political influence, power, and wealth, along with continuing and unfounded beliefs on their part that the American economy will, without fail, provide them increasing income from wages and salaries. And what we just saw, right, with COVID, with this pandemic, if this pandemic didn't teach us anything else, we recognize that the jobs we have today are not guaranteed tomorrow. and that the finances that we were banking on, that we believe are always going to be here, right, are fickle. And so there has to be another plan. The African community, the Black community, best have an economic plan, an economic plan B, right, in our back pockets for the next pandemic. Investment trends in the Black community. This was the main focus of Chapter 24, the Black consumer and the economics of Afrocentrism. Um, According to Wilson, the rather low interest many Blacks demonstrate in making investments, while probably reflecting their generally low wages and high cost of living, on a deeper level, reflects the fact that the economic role of Blacks in the American economy, as determined by dominant whites, is that of secondary laborers, salaried workers, or professionals, and above all, as that of consumers, not producers or owners. Wilson is saying that our current economic reality, right, lines up with the fact that for the most part we are cash cows for white folks. We are still the servants and laborers for mainstream society. We are still mainly consumers and not producers or owners. And all of that is what helps to explain our current economic reality right now. According to Wilson, the Black middle class invests in mutual funds far below the natural average, which contributes to our social problems. The solution to this: Black Americans must radically increase their savings if they are to achieve increased economic self-sufficiency and political power. All right? What does Wilson say here? Black Americans must radically increase their savings. Save, save, save. And this is a major conversation in the Black community, right? What are we saving for? Do we have the means and capacity to save our wealth and things of that nature, right? Wilson is telling us very clearly, right, that our current economic reality will not change until we radically increase our savings. According to Wilson, an investment club typically consists of 10 to 20 persons, most often comprised of family members, friends, and or people from all walks of life who meet regularly to learn investment principles, to combine their monies to build an investment portfolio. An investment portfolio, according to Wilson, is a combination of stocks, bonds, and other investment properties. So in these investment clubs, you have a group of people who come together, they meet regularly, right, to learn and discuss investment protocol, to learn the language of investment, to learn the culture of investment, right? They learn about investment principles. They learn about what investment portfolios are, right? According to Wilson, most clubs meet once a month to deposit their monthly investments, usually anywhere from $20 to $50, right? They review studies of stocks and to select a stock in which to invest. Many investment clubs are formed by experienced investors. While an investment club helps its members to learn more about investing, to build some familiarity and knowledge about corporations in the stock market, to help each member accumulate through small monthly payments, and over the years, a substantial security account. So the way in which this could look in our communities, right, is that we have identified one or multiple individuals in our community that's knowledgeable about investment, right? Uh, this is the individual that we appoint, right, as the president of our investment club, right? She or he are going to be responsible for organizing our meetings and what those meetings look like, right? But we've agreed on a set amount each month that we bring to that meeting that we're all are going to invest, that we're coming to invest with. We know that each month there's a particular stock that we are looking to invest in as a group. This is group economics. This is getting a group of people to stop thinking solely as individuals and now to start to think as a group. And this is why Wilson is talking to us about investment clubs. Because investment clubs, it gets groups of people to start to think as a group. Investment clubs operate according to the following principles. You are expected to invest a set sum once a month in common stocks, regardless of general market conditions. You reinvest the dividends and capital gains immediately, right? So any gains that you make, right, off of this investment, it goes back into the pot. We invest that, right? Your money grows faster if earnings are reinvested, right? As opposed to all the profits, every time we profit, we spend it, we ball, we turn it up. So any profits we get, those immediately get reinvested, right? So that the money grows faster. Buy growth stocks, companies whose salaries are increasing at a rate faster than the industry in general. So we got somebody in the group who's doing research, right, on the stocks that are said to have the fastest growth this year, that are projected to have the fastest growth next year. And those are the stocks that we are invested in, right? We're not just willy nilly just picking stuff out of the sky because it sounds good and throwing our money into the wind. Wilson suggests invest in different fields. This is called diversification. Diversification helps to spread risk, right? So that that risk doesn't just fall at the feet of one particular individual, organization, or institution. Investment clubs as financiers of Black-owned businesses. According to Wilson, investment clubs may also engage in entrepreneurial ventures. Though traditionally conservative, African American clubs may cautiously invest in fledgling Black owned corporations or well established Black owned corporations seeking public financing. Wilson explains that through an investment committee or an asset management organization, large Black organizations may form an investment consortium as a way of investing a relatively large sum of money regularly and earning sizable returns to be reinvested or invested in part in economic development projects. Wilson explains that African Americans as investors are crucial to the economic development and the political economic empowerment of the African American community as a whole. What Wilson is saying here, whether it is the Black venture capitalists, right, or it is Black individuals who are acting as financiers, right, these are going to be the individuals that make the most significant impact, right, in changing the economic reality of our community. These are the individuals who are going to be able to provide the largest loans, right, without strings attached. They're going to be the individuals who are able to provide funds to non-traditional borrowers, right? Folks that banks, mainstream banks and mainstream credit unions would never lend their money to, right? These Black venture capitalists and these Black financiers, these Black community development banks would be able to provide these resources. According to Wilson, deep knowledge of how the market works, the development of keen ability to invest in and use it are not only important for long-term personal or small group gain, but it is crucial to the expansion of Black-owned business establishments into the broader national and international marketplaces. Right. So the constant professional development, right, for our Black financiers is going to be critical. Right, if we're hoping to not only dominate in our own communities, right, but dominate the mainstream markets as well. Investment companies. According to Wilson, investment companies currently referred to as mutual funds, which are organizations which have as their sole purpose the ownership of securities of all types, including government bonds. And we will talk about uh, in chapter 30, when we discuss chapter 30, Wilson makes the argument that Black folks should own government securities, right? And we'll unpack that when we get there. But according to Wilson, a mutual fund is an investment collective where a group of investors pool their assets under professional management in order to hold in a company or to increase the value of its investors' capital, right? A mutual fund is an investment collective. So these Black folks who have uh, uh, a significant amount of money that they're looking to invest, a significant amount of resource that they're looking to invest, right? They're a group of these investors and they are pulling their assets under professional management. So we got somebody working with us, right, educating us and telling us, right, which stocks, which areas, which securities does it make more sense for us to go after, right? A mutual fund is a corporation. The investor in a mutual fund is therefore an owner, not a lender, who shares in the profits and losses, right, as well as in the income and expenses derived from the fund management of a relatively large and diversified portfolio. And so here Wilson is discussing creative ways by which we as Black folks can finance our economic objectives through creating a mutual fund. through organizing a group of Black investors, right? We are able to prioritize those stocks, those bonds, those securities, right, that have the most growth potential. We're able to target those businesses, organizations, and individuals in community who will need this money, who will need this money the most, and identify those people that we're going to get this money into their hands. So Wilson is saying, right, whether it's the Black venture capitalist, right, whether it is the Black rich wealthy individual, or whether it is Blacks who are operating through investment companies or operating as investment companies, right, that we are going to be the individuals who help to finance our own economic realities. So solutions. According to Wilson, there are millions of more dollars held by Black institutions and organizations. These millions, appropriately leveraged and organized into various consortiums, partnerships, and other economic formations instrumentally, manipulated by people imbued with an African-centric consciousness, intentionality, purpose, free-wielding, highly flexible, creatively, and ingenuity, and an iron will determination to win liberation by any means necessary, can deeply penetrate the American economy and establish the African American as a national and international force to be reckoned with. So what is Wilson saying here? Wilson is saying that the millions of dollars, right, that are owned and controlled by Black institutions, Black organizations, right, that we have housed currently in these white financial institutions, right, we can leverage our finances, we can leverage that wealth, right? To say to those folks, if you are not going to invest in our Black banks, invest in our Black businesses, invest in our Black organizations, we are going to take our monies from your institutions and we are going to invest them into our own communities, like we should be doing anyway. Like we should be doing anyway. But what Wilson is saying, right, is that for some of us who do not completely want to completely disengage, right, from the mainstream market, we can still leverage our support and our investment in those institutions, right, to support our own communities. And where those businesses, where those mainstream businesses, where those mainstream organizations refuse to capitulate to our demands, we are evidently uh, righteous in pulling our support, our financial support from those institutions. Thank you for your time, your focus, your attention as we went through Amos Wilson's chapters 27 and 29 of the Blueprint for Black Power. We only have two chapters remaining. Chapter 30, which will focus on specifically franchise cooperatives, corporations, and collective capitalism, right? Where we, again, are wrapping up the ways and means of financing our economic revitalization. And so in this chapter, Wilson really lays on cooperative economics and the art of the co-op. And then we end the Blueprint for Black Power with the crisis of leadership in the Black community, right? In order for us to do any of this work that we're talking about, we're going to need some very powerful, fearless, unapologetic Black leaders and community to do this work and to lead in this work. And Wilson talks about how we get there. All right. Peace, peace, family.